Greetings and welcome. Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Headlines, our weekly or every other week look at how stories are put together and what goes on behind the scenes at the Post and Courier. With me today, I'm Glenn Smith, the Watchdog and Public Service Editor. And with me today is Stephen Hobbs, who works with me on the Special Projects team. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone the event is being recorded and will be sent out afterwards with contact information in case you have additional questions. I'd also encourage everyone who has questions to submit them through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So we are here today to talk about Stephen Hobbs' engaging and troubling look at the toxic legacy of the old Exide car battery factory in Greer, South Carolina. That's in our upstate region. Stephen spent months digging into this story, assembling a mountain of documents and plumbing the tangled history of the battery plant. Among other things, he found that Exide, during its decade-long ownership of the plant, exposed some employees to levels of lead more than 30 times above a federal limit. Clouds of lead dust at times flowed unabated towards nearby communities with young children as well. So pretty scary stuff. Okay, we'll get going here, Stephen. So how did you first learn about this story and what drew you to it? Why did you feel compelled to dig into the history of this long shuttered plant on the other side of the state?
Yeah, so it really dated back to a couple years ago, back to 2020. And I had been asking around, just kind of looking for ideas. And as I was talking around and talking to people, one person that I spoke with mentioned that there was this plant there and that there were concerns about lead exposure in the past, and there were some lawsuits filed. So then that starts kind of an interesting part of our job, right? This hunt to find information. And so I started to looking at these lawsuits and found that there were many children that had guardians filed lawsuits on their behalf that said that they were exposed to lead. And so even though this was a long time ago, we felt like it was an opportunity to actually look into something. One of these things that happens is when there are concerns at the time, there's maybe news coverage, but then it's hard to know like what the long-term effects are of something like this. So we felt like this gave us an opportunity to really look back at maybe what happened and check back in on the people who had lawsuits filed on behalf or grew up near the plant, and just see kind of what they felt about the experience and what they thought about just the plant overall.
Yeah, so you bring up a really good point there too. Sometimes you get so caught up in the heat of coverage, right, and breaking events, and you're trying to get the news out to people in a really quick way, and it comes out piecemeal, right? Nobody takes time further down the line to do more of a comprehensive account and put all the pieces together and what it meant. And in this instance, you were able to look back at the whole legacy of this thing and what it did over time to these folks, which I thought was an important contribution to the history of this story. But that's challenging, right, in and of itself to do this. And Exide stopped making batteries at the plant in 1996, and some of this stuff dates back to the 1960s. So how, as a reporter, how do you go about assembling this mountain of documents and digging in? I'm sure it's scattered all over the place. How do you recreate the events that happened there so long afterwards?
Yeah, so it really is the part of our job that is kind of like putting together a puzzle piece. And so I had these documents in these lawsuits, which mentioned some people, mentioned some details, but it wasn't complete. And so what I ended up having to do was look for other places where there might be bits of information. So one of the things was that these lawsuits were filed, became the subject of a bankruptcy case, federal bankruptcy case. So then I went to the bankruptcy court and asked for certain documents, right? And that was a hard process because if anyone has experience in bankruptcy cases, I mean, there are many, many documents filed, especially for a large company like this. So the docket of information is just so long. And so one of the interesting things I found out was you could search by like who filed a piece of information or who the filer was. So I was able to track down, okay, these documents are relevant to the cases that I'm looking at. And then you have to ask the bankruptcy court in Delaware to then send documents. And so that was a process, but that wasn't complete because, as you mentioned, this plant had been around since the 1960s. There were concerns for many years about lead exposure that nearby residents had. And so there were federal lawsuits filed in South Carolina. Well, because these cases were so old, they're housed at, I didn't realize this, but there's the National Archives at Atlanta, but then there's also the Federal Records Center at Atlanta, two different entities that house these records. So you go to one and they say, well, we don't have that. You need to go to the other, or we need a certain number. And mind you, this was kind of in the middle of COVID and COVID restrictions. So there was one entity which I was emailing and they said, we'll be able to get back to you when we have the staffing to go back and look, or it might take many months to actually check on those records because we don't have the staff in there to check on it. And then there were some cases where I went to Greenville County, which is one of the counties in that upstate region, and they said, okay, a case had been transferred to the federal court, but we don't have records of it anymore, or we were supposed to have it, but it's not in our storage facility. So one of the challenges in a case like this is there can be a lot of documentation that is available. It's just that sometimes you have to go all over to try to find it and piece it together. So ultimately, it was just trying to do that over days and days and months of just piecing that together.
So another behind the scenes nugget here. So Stephen pitches this story to me and a couple other editors, at the end of 2020, I guess?
Yeah.
And we're like, boy, that sounds interesting, but this factory closed a while ago. It'd be interesting to see if we can bring it forward and what the legacy is today and all this. Before you go ahead, maybe you could pick away at it a little bit, find out a little bit more information, and then come back to us. So Stephen ends up doing all these other stories during the year, kind of forgot all about the battery plant story. And then at the end of 2021, he comes over and says, hey, I took your advice and did a little bit more digging. And he had assembled like 10,000 pages or something of information. He had all these interviews. And I was like, oh my goodness, he had all this stuff. It was great. So we quickly green-lighted this. And I don't know how many times we went over the story as, we built it and put it together. But one thing that really always stuck with me on each reading was your descriptions of what it was like inside the plant. And like, you really put people there. Can you talk a little bit about what the working conditions were like for people there?
Yeah, so one of the challenges, in addition to the documents, was that this plant no longer exists. There's just like a concrete slabs really in this grass that's there. So it was really important to just try to figure out what it was like. And one of the great things about the documents, right, is it provided us names of people who had accused the company of exposing them to lead when they lived nearby. But it also provided us names of people who had worked at the company. And so that was a really great way to find people who had worked there. And as we started to find out, and as we mentioned in the story, a lot of those people have since died. And so it wasn't always successful. Or another kind of behind the scenes thing is, as we all know, numbers have changed a lot over the years in terms of people no longer have landline numbers, or people have changed their cell phones. So just finding people who maybe had a certain number in 1996, it's not going to be easy necessarily to find them in 2020, 2021, or 2022. But fortunately, we were able to find a lot of people. And that was one of the things that was really interesting, was just to have them describe what they remember. And one of the things that people really remember about working there is the heat. There were these big kind of vats that were used to melt lead and other materials that were used to make the batteries. And sometimes those could get up 800 degrees. People talked about, them looking over and seeing it being like 1,000 degrees. And it's really hard, I think, for me to even imagine what that is like. If it's 100 degrees or on a humid day in Charleston, it could feel like, we're like melting, right? But when you think about what that temperature was like, that was really just stuck with me. But then I think another detail was just the sweating, right? That people are wearing these
Yeah.
respirators and there's all this dust, but then they're like sweating so much that it's kind of moving around. And again, I think we have a more of appreciation of that now with having to wear just masks due to COVID. And so we all kind of know what it's like in maybe a regular environment, in an air conditioning environment, how uncomfortable it is to wear a mask all day. But imagine where it's, you're in an environment where it's really hot and you're trying to wear this mask. So that was really kind of illuminating. And then also just other aspects of the job, right? You're having to assemble these bits and pieces that go into the batteries. There's acid that's used, and the fumes from the acid was in different places of the building. So I think it was really relying on the senses that people remember, because those were still fresh in people's minds about what it was like to work there.
So you referenced earlier some of the challenges you face over time with getting a hold of people who move and change numbers. How do you go about overcoming that and find those people? And then when you finally did connect with them, what was the sort of reaction you got when you show up at the door and say, hey, I want to talk about this job you had like 20 years ago?
Yeah, so there was a lot of just calling numbers that I hoped wouldn't be dead, and they eventually were, and just trying the next one. So there was a lot of just kind of like, if I don't make that extra call, I kind of won't know what happened. And what was exciting, I mean, some of the most exciting parts of it was there was times when I maybe made that extra call, or I decided to, yeah, knock on someone's door, and it actually led to something. And so that, it was kind of reinforcing as to why you kind of keep going, because you just don't know sometimes what that next call will lead to. But there was a lot of surprise when I was talking to people about this history, and people had very much kind of moved on from it in their minds. But again, it was a challenge, but also could be a benefit, which is sometimes you get people, right, say after they've left a company or right after a plant closes, and maybe they don't want to talk about it, or they are just concerned about the employer doing something to them. But 20 years later, maybe nothing has really happened and they moved on, that the plant's no longer there. Maybe they feel a little bit more open about talking about it. So it was a mix. There were some people who still weren't, wanting to talk about it, but then there were others who I think were kind of like, hey, it's been so long, let me just tell you some of what I remember and some of the details. And so that was helpful about that. And with some people, they didn't want to be quoted, but at least I knew I was able to talk to them about their experience, and then that helps build my understanding of what it's like to be in there. So every person I talked to provided some bits of information that was helpful.
Yes, so then you get this stuff, and it's very alarming and you know very, very damning in some instances. And you want to be fair and you want to get the other side of the story, but here you have a company that declared bankruptcy in 2020, sort of ceases to exist. It splits off into different components, with one part of the operation ending up overseas, and everybody's sort of like, talk to that guy. So how do you go about like getting the comment when it's all fractured like that?
Yeah, that was another challenge, another real challenge. And one thing that we talked about was just trying to talk to as many people as we can, look into court documents, try to see, say, what the company responded at the time of these allegations to get their perspective, because it's important. We want to get the perspective of the company and people involved to make sure, again, like you said, we're being fair with our reporting. So yeah, you mentioned this overseas company, and so that was a real challenge, because they had an operations in France, and so with the time difference and everything, trying to call their operation, trying to call the operations or a business that they have in the UK to try to speak with someone in English, and they didn't have a person to transfer me over to someone in France. So I wasn't able to do that. And this is after I'd emailed them and tried to contact them to their website and hadn't got any response. And it was really important that someone at least acknowledged it. So then I was eventually able to to try to call someone in France, but then it's in French, and I don't really know French that well. I was trying to speak with someone who spoke English, and this was one kind of interesting thing where I got transferred to someone, and who I was trying to explain that I was doing media, or I was trying to find someone who was involved in media questions. And I got transferred to this person and was trying to explain, and they said, I'm not at my office. I'm going to be back at my office. Can you call me back? Well, I had been transferred to them and I didn't know their number. And so I'm trying to explain this, and they're in their car and they're saying, no, just call me back in 20 minutes. Okay. And so it was like things like that where you just kind of run into a dead end. But eventually I was able to, after sending some more emails and trying to find people that worked there, got a response from the company. So that was one that was especially just kind of challenging, but glad that we did it and was able to get the response in there.
Yeah, for sure. So I didn't even know some of that stuff. That's interesting. I also didn't know you have some limited proficiency in French.
Yes, I very, very limited proficiency. So I took it in middle school and was not very good at it. So, but I was able to use what very little proficiency I had to try to get them to find someone who spoke English. So yes.
Oh, but better you than me in that situation, I guess.
Yes.
So a part of the story, we touched on the bankruptcy. A big part of this story was the fact that the company declares bankruptcy in 2020 for the third time, I think. And at this occasion, they basically say, we don't have the money to clean up this plant or other plants around the country, and we're bankrupt. And they just more or less just walk away from everything. Although they did put up a pool of money that was deemed like wildly, insufficient to cover the cost of the cleanup. They did put up some money to do that. How is this sort of thing allowed to happen, I guess? And if other states, where Exide had plants, if anyone tried to push back and claw back some of that responsibility, or?
Yeah, so this was one of the things that we learned, through this process, was that bankruptcy law there's this conflict between bankruptcy law and environmental law. Bankruptcy law allows companies to get a fresh start. And there are environmental laws that are obviously in place to try to get, people who are accused of polluting or, had maybe toxic material that they were working with to try to clean that up. And so that can kind of have clashes. And this was an example where Exide said in 2020 in the bankruptcy, as you said, that they wanted to abandon these properties if the states and federal government didn't come to some sort of agreement. They said, we're just going to abandon them. And so eventually the state of South Carolina, other states across the country, and the Environmental Protection Agency or federal agencies did come to an agreement. But just the fact that they were able to kind of threaten this showed that they really did have at least an advantage, or at least, that they weren't going to have to pay for everything. And so that was a very interesting thing to find out. And in California, there were some lawmakers who were hoping that this agreement wouldn't go through. They felt like the company had not paid fully for pollution that was around a plant, and the fact that people were exposed to lead nearby in a plant there. I think it was a recycling plant that was there. Ultimately, the bankruptcy judge approved the deal because pretty much it's if there's not kind of an imminent harm that is posed by a site, bankruptcy law or courts have ruled that bankruptcy law allows this to happen. So even though these lawmakers pushed back against it and called for officials not to approve the deal went through. And so I would imagine this is something that could come up again. I mean, this is not an issue that is only limited to this case.
Interesting. Why don't take a couple questions here for readers, make sure we get those in. If one fellow asked, did you talk to, the story featured one man who felt his life had gone off the rails because of his lead exposure, and he had ended up in state prison, I believe, in regard to an armed robbery charge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the reader wants to know, have you talked to the person in prison, and do you know what his lead level was?
Yeah. So this was a perfect example of building off of um, previous reporting that we had done. So there was a story that Glenn and I were involved in looking into prisons in South Carolina and an incident at a prison in South Carolina. And so I had experience writing letters to inmates in South Carolina. So I wrote him a letter, and he called me. I forget exactly what month it was, but he called me last year, and we spoke about his experience. So I did talk with him about what he remembered. And what was really interesting, right, was he was a young child when he lived near the plant, but there were still some details that he remembered just about kind of growing up there and playing around in the dirt and other things when he was living there. So I did speak with him. I do remember his lead levels. I don't remember exactly what they are off the top of my head, but I remember that there were pretty serious levels of lead at the time, and especially now. Just one of the things that was surprising about my research was that public health officials say that there is no safe level of lead for a child, and so there's really a concern of the impact that lead can have on the development of the brains of children. And so even just any amount of lead can be a problem, but definitely the amount of lead that he had was serious.
Yeah, just by frame of reference too, in South Carolina, the prison system does not allow you to interview inmates directly. So, as reporters, we have to go where the story is and the truth is. So under the law, they have to allow you to contact them in some way. So we found perhaps the best way to do so is through letter writing, because they're not supposed to have phones in there or have access to interview you. But sometimes you got to do some creative things to make those interviews work, for sure.
Yeah.
Got a couple questions that are a little technical here. Hopefully you can answer these, Stephen. Has the lead leached into the groundwater? And if so, how far out from the site is the water contaminated, or is it considered at safe levels? Do you know?
So I don't know what the current status of things are in terms of that, but I do know that the State Department of Health and Environmental Control did many years ago have concerns about the amount of lead that was getting into groundwater, and there was monitoring that started of certain wells. And so actually, if I remember correctly, I believe that the State Department of Health is still conducting monitoring of groundwater and of like surface water, of water that's going across the site, and monitoring that for lead and other chemicals, and treating some of that water as well. So definitely, if there are specific questions you have or want to know what the current status of it is, maybe go to the State Department of Health for that. But I know it's definitely been a concern, or at least was a concern at the time that the plant was operating back in the 80s and 90s.
Sort of in a similar vein here, do you know how far from the egg site site that they have sampled for lead contamination, specifically in the direction of the prevailing winds and along the routes that rainwater flow from the site? And are those the test results available to the public? Do you know?
I would imagine the test results are available to the public, and of what they've found. I'll say what I know, or at least the most maybe significant study of lead in the surrounding area was done by the Environmental Protection Agency. They produced a report in 2001 that really studied lead, that where lead was found in an area where a nearby trailer park was, as well in other parts around the plant. Now this is directly kind of around the plant, so it probably is within like a third of a mile. So I'm not aware of any studies that have been done that say tested if lead went out a mile or a half mile or more. But I know that this study really looked in a detailed way at the soil that was found around the plant, tried to look for different things like metals or other elements that might have been, that was in that soil, to see if it kind of matched up with what the plant emissions would have been versus, say, emissions from cars or some natural source of lead. So there was a pretty detailed study that was done, but again, these were of areas that were within like 1,000 feet or so of the plant. So I'm not sure exactly about that surrounding area, but definitely, again, the State Department of Health should have more information about kind of what studies or what they know about the lead contamination in that area.
Okay. So given kind of the interest, I guess, in these questions of where the lead ended up and where it is now and all that stuff, talk a little bit, if you could, just about some of the future plans for that area. What's been talked about, I guess, for going in and around that plant site?
Yeah, so there are kind of two properties related to kind of that Exide used to own, which no longer own. One is the site of where the plant was, and another is kind of these empty lots. So a developer purchased the empty lots that are right next to where the old plant site used to be, and is hoping to develop those with things like townhomes and some single family homes and patio homes in an area. Now, there's definitely some concerns from residents who already live there. There's concerns about, say, traffic, about kind of changing up this neighborhood. There are some folks that are concerned about kind of what could be kicked up in the dirt if this is developed again. There was lead removed from dirt in that area, but I think people still have concerns about what still may be there. And so there's kind of that development. The developer also is interested in possibly buying the side of the plant and that open land and developing it maybe with potentially homes or other development. Again, I think it'll be decided yet. It hasn't been determined, but that could also be the site of future homes or at least businesses or other things. And so there could be a lot of changes to that land, and people might not even know that anything was there other than what it ends up being.
Yeah, and I mean, should point out too, I know DHEC is Department of Health has stressed that, a lot of dirt has been pulled out of that site, a lot of mitigation has been done already, and that, before anything could be built there, they would be monitoring that and make sure that it's safe. But
absolutely.
So it'd be interesting if all this stuff happens and it's reclaimed and put back into use. I guess that would be the long-term goal of everybody.
That seems to be it. Yeah, is to try to get it back, because back to I guess being the use, because yeah, it is just really empty plots of land that not much is going on there now. And so there is kind of through the bankruptcy, this complicated process, which I won't get into, but someone else kind of owns the land, and they have some money from Exide, and they're trying to kind of evaluate it and do different things and trying to sell it. So that is definitely their goal, to try to find a new owner of that land. So whoever does buy it will, I think, determine what the future is for it.
Okay. Well, such a compelling story you wrote, and really comprehensive and intriguing look at that site and everything that went on there over the years. Thank you so much for doing that. I want to thank everyone for watching today, and I want you to remember that you can sign up for any of our free newsletters at postingcourier.com/newsletter-sign-up. If you're a subscriber, we'd like to say thank you very much. If you're not a subscriber, feel free to subscribe, and you can sign up at postingcourier.com/subscribe. Thanks for joining us this week, and we will be back soon with another installment. And I hope everyone has a fantastic day.